Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. You're welcome to join this particular webinar. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar. The topic we're covering is unlocking investment in green construction in Africa. I am delighted to see such a diverse group of participants joining us from policymaker, investor, engineers, architects, academics, and sustainable advocates around the world. So welcome to this particular meeting. The topic we are discussing today could not be more timely. Africa is urbanizing at one of the fastest rates in the world, with an estimated 1.3 billion people projected to live in city by 2050. This rapid growth creates both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is clear. Traditional construction methods often consume vast amounts of energy, generate significant carbon emission, and strain already fragile ecosystem. The opportunity, however, is that Africa has the chance to leapfrog, to design, finance, and deliver green, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure from outset. Green construction is not just about using eco-friendly material or meeting carbon targets only. It's about reimagining the built environment to create a healthier city, reduce life cycle costs, and stimulate innovation and unlock long-term economic value. But make this vision a reality, we must actually capitalize in the way we look at construction infrastructure. So today I'm really delighted that we've got a lot of experts to join us in this conversation. This is the first of many of the Construct Africa webinar to come under the title of Building a Better Africa webinar series. And I am delighted to join you as your, moderator for today's meeting. And it goes without saying that I should spend a while before we introduce the panelists on basic introduction to the Construct Africa. So next slide, please. Construct Africa, your edge in Africa construction landscape. We provide reliable, on-the-ground intelligence to help you navigate African construction market with confidence. From tracking up-and-coming projects to understanding key players, we give you the insight you need to move fast, reduce risk, and seize opportunity. Clear, practical, actionable. That's the Construct Africa difference. So we're delighted to help you with this. You probably ask, who am I? My name is Nelson Ogunshakin. I'm the chair of the advisory board for this organization. And it is a delight, to welcome you all participants wherever you are in joining us. To kickstart the conversation, we need to go on to who are the speakers. These are the experts in the industry. And can we move the slide, please, to the next one? We've got five fantastic, panelists here. They all come from different backgrounds, but complementary. They bring the breadth and expertise together to address the issue. We'll go through the name very quickly, and then I will also ask them to do a very quick introduction, not more than 1 minute introduction. So I'm going to start off with Mr. Opuiyo Oforiokuma, who is a senior partner, African 50 Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. Opuiyo, would you want to do a quick introduction of yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nelson. As the slide already shows, I'm a senior partner of the Africa 50 Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, which is a private equity vehicle established by Africa 50 Group. Africa 50 Group is a multilateral Pan-African asset manager headquartered in Casablanca, Morocco, which is where I'm speaking from today. At the level of the group, we have 37 shareholders, 33 of whom are African countries. That is over 60% or 70%, I would say, of the countries on the continent. And, our focus is really about helping to bridge what is a significant infrastructure gap on the continent. And we seek to do that through a double bottom line approach of making attractive risk-adjusted financial returns, but also measurable development impact. Africa is where we focus on, we specialize on it. From a personal standpoint, I'm privileged to have had almost 4 decades in the infrastructure space globally, and I returned back to Africa back in 2006. I'm Nigerian, and I'm proudly so, and very, very pleased to be able to be contributing to the Africa infrastructure story today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Opuiyo, for that quick introduction. I'll do the same thing with Dr. Olubukola Tokede as well. Would you like to do a quick introduction of yourself? I believe you are somewhere in Italy, from what I
Yes.
can. Are you still with us?
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Olubukola Tokede. Just like Mr. Opuiyo as well, my heritage is Nigerian. I am the Associate Head of School International for the School of Architecture and Built Environment, Deakin University in Australia, and I am very honored to be part of this eminent group of panelists. My background is civil engineering, and my teaching area over the last 10 years has included construction finance. But more specifically, I'm also a life cycle assessment certified practitioner, and I recently founded the African LCA initiative. I am deeply passionate about sustainable futures, and I am also currently one of the Construct Africa industry board members. So I look forward to contributing to this conversation, and thank you very much, Dr. Nelson Ogunshakin.
Thank you very much, Tokede, for that quick introduction. Can I bring Mrs. Bukola Odoe as well to do a quick introduction of herself? You know, you're here. Can you join us?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bukola, and I'm the Special Advisor to the Governor of Lagos State on public-private partnerships. I've occupied this role for a little bit over 2 years. And what the Office of Public-Private Partnerships does is to bridge the gap between the private sector and the public sector. We are interested in quite a number of projects, particularly as they relate to the governor's development agenda, cutting across major areas of transport, energy, health, and agriculture. I'm very excited to be amongst this esteemed group of panelists here today, and I hope I can contribute my fair share of information to what is being discussed here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bukola. Now, can I invite Matthew Jordan Tang from EBRD, please?
Thank you very much, Nelson, and to Construct Africa and everyone on the panel. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I am the Director for Project Preparation at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, based in London. I've been in this role for several years now and came to EBRD having spent 8 or 9 years working in Latin America. So I've been with multilateral development banks for most of my career. I've always worked in infrastructure. I'm an urban and transport planner by background and lead a team that prepares over 100 projects across energy, transport, and municipalities for about 5 billion euros in fresh financing each year. We manage a portfolio of about 30 billion. And most pertinently, I think for this discussion, EBRD is starting to work in 6 sub-Saharan African markets. And so really happy to be with you. We're very excited to start work this year. And there's so much to do and do it in partnership with all of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It sounds like an exciting time for EBRD in Africa, you know, bridging the gap to sub-Saharan Africa. So we're delighted to have you on board. Then let me move to the last person on the panelist, which is Jenni Chamberlain. Jenni, are you with us? I think you are.
Yes, thank you, Nelson, and thank you, Dr. Shagan, for the invitation and fellow distinguished panelists. Delighted to be here today. Jenni Chamberlain from Altree Capital. I started Altree in 2006. We've been investing across the continent for the last almost 2 decades. 2 decades. And our current fund focuses on ensuring that we deploy capital to women and youth across sub-Saharan Africa, primarily opportunistically in North Africa, and with a very strong climate focus. By climate, we look at 3 climate verticals. That is food systems, renewable energy, and e-mobility. And prior to that, I worked in investment banking in London and New York, and I am proudly South African. So I think that's me in a nutshell. Thanks. Over to you, Nelson.
Thank you very much, Jenni. And for those who've heard in the passage of the conversation, you hear Dr. Shego, who is the founder and the publisher. You are there. So rather than just ignore you, can I ask you to just show your face so people know who you are? Dr. Shego, are you there as well?
Yes, I am here.
A quick introduction.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I want to say a special welcome to all the participants at this evening's webinar. We're really looking forward to an exciting time with the distinguished and diverse array of panelists that we have lined up. So I would just say sit back, relax, and enjoy the discussions. I must say, though, that as we're having the discussions, there's a Q&A box right at the bottom. Just click on it if you have any question and put in your questions there, and we'll be taking them at the end of the webinar. Thank you once more, and welcome to the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Shegun. There's so many doctors here. For those who haven't got doctor, please don't feel intimidated. Feel free. This is a typical African syndrome. We get a lot of qualification, but what really matters most is the conversation we're going to have now. Dr. Shegun already given us an insight to the queue. The way I want to take this is really to be very open, very casual in our conversation. We've got quite a lot of people here. More people will join. I want to put a plug in the sense that whatever is being said here will be recorded and also will be uploaded on Construct Africa's, website for other people who could not make it to watch it later on. It's important that this conversation goes beyond today's meeting. Now, let me just start by saying it's a pleasure to have you all once again. I know you all individually and collectively over the years. And for those who doesn't know me, my name. I've been around. Opuiyo said he's been around for 4 decades. I think I've been 4 decades about the same time. So we've been traveling the same journey. We've traveled the infrastructure concept all over the world. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through my CV. Suffice to say that I'm in the public domain. What matters most, we have 4 topics that we want to cover. I would suggest, because of the way we're going to take this particular setting, that if you are not speaking, please mute so that we don't get echo in the process coming through. I understand that the lady behind the scene, Diane, she's going to help us to make sure at least we're picking up the question. Now, the 4 topics that we really want to cover today are self-explanatory. One is to look at the current state of green construction or infrastructure in Africa. Second is to look at the investment opportunity and trends. And thirdly is to look at the role of financial institutions. And of course, the top one is sustainability assessment methodology. So I do believe that the collective expertise around the table should help us to address those 4 questions. But I do know that you all come from different backgrounds, different parts of it, either finance or development or asset management. I need the breadth and the collective view of everybody in our conversation. So for us to give it a kickstart, I'm going to try and see that we can cover as much as we can in the first 60 minutes of this to cover those 4 questions as much as we can. So for those who are participants, please be patient with us. Listen to what is being said and pile your question there so that we can pick the question up later on. We will devote a dedicated 15 minutes for Q&A, and after that, we'll wrap up. So we are still very much on time in terms of our proceeding, so be patient with us. So as we go through the conversation, please feel free to raise the issue. So we have 5 panelists. Each and every one of them already introduced themselves, and they will give you an indication of where they're coming from. I would like to invite Opuiyo first, really to set the scene in terms of what is green construction as a concept, how does it relate to Africa issue, and is green construction a prevailing concept in Africa? So it's really to open up the conversation from the point of view of what is the subject matter we're talking about. So Opuiyo, can I ask you to give us that quick 2-3 minute insight as a starting point? Okay.
No, thanks a lot, Nelson. I think in summary, what green construction is all about is finding environmentally efficient, if you like, and friendly ways of designing, building, and then operating infrastructure, and of course, in this context, we are thinking about Africa. When I think about that, I often think about a process chain. At the start of all of this needs to be about finance. Even before you can design and build, somebody's putting in monetary resources, and even if it's people's time costs money. So there's a whole question about, if we're going to focus on this concept of green infrastructure, where's the money going to come from for this? Then there's the issue about how you design whatever asset it is that you want to build. And in this regard, you're then thinking of, for example, in terms of the physical layout, and I know that Dr. Tokede, I beg your pardon, is in the field of architecture. So you're looking at how do you use the space available, what sort of materials do you intend to use, making sure that, for example, you ensure energy efficiency in those buildings and hopefully the least adverse impact in terms of contributing to global emissions. Thereafter, somebody has to actually build it, which is the act of construction. And you must think there about, okay, even as you're doing so, you have your plant and equipment. What sort of fuel sources are you using? If you think about it from a point of view of E&S, environmental and social standards, what is your approach, for example, to managing occupational health and safety? How are you dealing with the disposal and management of hazardous waste that comes out, which itself could be damaging to the environment, and so on and so forth. Now, at the end of the day, we don't build infrastructure just for the sake of looking at it. Whether it's a building, it's a road or power plant or whatever, you have to then think about the end user experience, which is what they will go through during that operating phase. Again, there's a question of energy efficiency. There's a question of safety around that. There's a question of the economics. All of these things must be considered. Now, if I then look at it from the perspective of Africa, the reality is, if you ask me, the concept of green construction is not yet a thing. In fact, when you think about the whole greening or the environmental focus in Africa, whilst Africa is arguably the most adversely impacted by the adverse effects of climate change, the truth is that we're arguably equally the least prepared. And, we're still in that process of trying to ramp up. I'm sure we can talk about this subject in more detail later. Maybe one final thing as well to say, there are also a lot of impediments to being able to really make this a thing on the continent. Access to finance. If you look at, the total amount, say, of climate finance available today, something about $1.4 trillion globally, only about 3% of that has found its way to Africa. So there's a total lack of capital available to do this. And, in terms of the basic need on the continent, whilst there are some very, very well-endowed parts of the continent where the economies are strong and people are doing well, the reality is that when you look at the total 1.5 billion number of people here, a lot of us actually are in poverty. And so the basic need to develop, especially based on energy sources, itself places a challenge because some of the sort of green energy solutions, the renewable energy solutions themselves are not truly in sufficiency on the continent. And we still need a balanced energy mix whilst technology and other solutions come about to ensure the base load energy available to support development. So there are cultural dimensions, there are physical and financial and other dimensions that have to be thought through, especially as we talk about focusing on a green concept. But is it a good idea to think about it? Absolutely. Climate change is real. As I've already said, Africa is arguably the most adversely impacted continent in the world, even though it's the least, amongst the least in terms of the contribution to global emissions, about 3 to 4% of whole. But we can't say because we don't contribute, we don't do anything about it. We have to. So let me stop there at this point and leave this for other panelists to fill in. And
thank you very much.
More time, I'll speak more about this later on.
Thank you for setting the scene. I think if I get your comment is we've got to take a holistic view of the whole issue of procurement of green construction and infrastructure. So I think, setting the scene there, Opuiyo, is absolutely fantastic because you've challenged us. It is real. We can't walk away from it, but the appropriate technology for different continents, for where we are, we need to recognize that. Now, at this point in time, you've set that scene from an asset management point of view, and I happen to be an engineer. I've been around for 40 years. I've been around with you, Opuiyo, work with you on a different particular issue, both power project, transport project. I know exactly what the challenge is. Getting the basic right sometimes is fundamental. And then also looking at opportunity that will come as we go through how do we leapfrog? Yes, we have opportunity for hydro, we have opportunity for solar, we got that. Are we doing it properly? Let me bring other panelists into the issue. I'm going to bring Jenni. You're looking at it from different angle. What's your take on the subject in terms of, current state of the green construction and infrastructure in Africa? What's your current view, Jenni?
Thank you, Nelson, for that question. And for me, very much aligned. I think it's very nascent with everything that Opuiyo has discussed today. And absolutely, I think certainly coming at it also from a finance perspective, I think there's a lot of work still to be done. But we are really excited because from our perspective, we actually, one of our portfolio companies has actually just sold the second private ITMO, which is an internationally transferable mitigation outcome, a fancy name for a carbon credit, to the Swiss government. And I think this is an example of how, and I know we'll come to this in a minute, but in more detail, but how green finance can really mitigate risk and be used to equally and to address equality, I think, in many areas. So as a fund that invests at the nexus of gender and climate across the continent, women and girls and the youth are generally more impacted by climate change. And as Opuiyo stated, often the least prepared, unfortunately. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. There are obviously sometimes higher costs associated with green construction, and perhaps not always. And I think if you look at the entire lifespan, something that I think Dr. Bukola will come to in a minute, but I think you can probably offset that. But I think there's a perception that project costs are significantly higher if you're looking to manufacture or construct green projects in Africa. I think the regulatory environment is still complex globally as a result of the Paris Agreement, and that takes a lot of negotiation. And I think, unfortunately, the continent also lacks some knowledge gaps and some skill shortages to be able to execute on this. And then I think another big issue also touched upon was land planning issues and environmental resource stresses as well. So I think those are just some of the issues that we see, but we see huge opportunity at the same time to use green finance to transform our economies in the kind of a just energy transition. So we're really excited about the opportunities that it does bring.
Thanks very much, Jenni. So I hear Opuiyo saying, take a holistic view, but understand where we are. Jenni is saying it's a huge opportunity, even on carbon credit. Some people think this is just an esoteric issue. It's not doable. It has been done. So can I bring, if I can get it, let me just bring Matthew on board. Matthew, you're looking at it from the point of view now, EBRD is going into sub-Saharan Africa. You're already in Morocco, you're in Tunisia, you're in Egypt, but now you're going really into Africa with 6 new countries, and you are in the policy-making side. How do you see the opportunity in Africa?
Yeah, great. Well, it's listen. I think, of course, there are tremendous opportunities. Let me start with all the positives that people know about. One, the demographics, of course. It's a hugely important continent. It's growing in importance. The demographics will be behind that. And, in terms of infrastructure, that means growth. And so there's not only a huge need to sort of get the appropriate level of infrastructure networks and service levels in place, but also, you can confidently invest in that kind of environment. We've been working for 30 years in sort of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and frankly, there are almost no countries that have any demographic growth whatsoever. In fact, many are stagnating and have been for decades. So this is very, very different, and we recognize that creates a dynamic that's very, very interesting. The need is, of course, there, and I think in order to I think part of the challenge is that there is a perception that everything is so difficult. The scale is not there yet. There's sort of a lack of awareness of the reality on the ground. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. The perceptions are sort of misaligned with reality. So I guess what we'd like to do is we'd like to be humble, and we'd like to partner with organizations and people who have been doing successful projects And so that's the first thing. We're going to be, of course, hiring the best people we can find to work with us. We're setting up local offices in all of those countries, which is, just to tell you and be clear, it's Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal. And so we want to bring what we've done best as EBRD in the past, which is focusing on specific projects with strong institutional and regulatory support behind them, making sure that there's creditworthiness to do the projects, providing support to government actors, whether it's national or subnational at the municipal level, to prepare the projects robustly, and then wherever it makes sense, bring in the private sector to invest in these projects. And that's where our advisory work on PPPs comes into play. So it's really about just seeing where we can work. There are already interesting opportunities coming up. We're going to be rolling those out in the next months. But overall, I see it as a glass half full. There's so many things to work on and great openness. But again, we're going to go in with a humble state of mind, work with others, and try to do the best we can as we move forward. So I'll stop there as an intro.
Matthew, thank you very much. I like the word humble. And I like the strategy of riding on the back of those who are there, who's been there, got the t-shirt, but understanding. And it seems like a wise and a very prudent approach. Can I bring Mrs. Bukola on? You are representing the state governor in Lagos State. And you said in your introduction that you've just taken up the role, but it seems like you are making waves. We will talk about regulatory later on. We'll talk about other things, but just share with us. I mean, if somebody said to me, biggest city in Africa, maybe you talk about Cairo, followed by Lagos, or is it Lagos first? What is the opportunity if you take Lagos as a classic example of a big mega city? What is the opportunity? We'll come to regulatory later on. At this point, I'm just looking at opportunity. What is the opportunity in Lagos and wider Nigeria as a particular area? Bukola?
Thank you, Ogunshakin. So just to also quickly piggyback off of what Opuiyo mentioned earlier, he said, Africa contributes about 3 to 4% to the total global emissions that we have. But unfortunately, Africa has felt the brunt of the worst consequences of this menace. So for me, looking at sustainability as my focus and also looking at what we can do in Africa, just at the recently concluded Africa's Green Economy Summit, we could see a pipeline deal of over $1.4 billion pitched on just green projects in Africa alone in 2024. And that more than tripled in 2025 in terms of what was presented, to going over $7 billion. So what this tells us is there's a growing interest in investing and funding green projects in Africa. Now, bringing this back to Nigeria, I would have to say that Nigeria has been a little bit late to the game. But having said that, we've been trying to catch up as best as we can in Lagos State. Lagos State is one of the first, well, not one of the first, it's actually the first subnational to be issuing a green bond. We have this to be issued imminently. And in terms of green projects that are being financed, it cuts across the areas of renewable energy. So solar, replacing traditional lights with solar in the schools and in the hospitals. And what this does is it's a clarion call to investors who want to invest in alternative projects that are designed to maybe not necessarily bring back the largest returns, but in terms of impact investing, you've got it right there. So for us, in terms of opportunities, I would say now is the time to come into Nigeria and by extension Lagos State for green energy projects. And what I said earlier in terms of the investment pipeline for Africa, we've seen over $7 billion pitched just at this year's Aegis alone. So, and that obviously includes all other countries in Africa. So for Lagos State, I would definitely say that now is the time to come in and invest.
Thank you. Can I bring Dr. Bukola, Tokede in? I know you come from the point of view of how do we measure, but I just want to have your perspective on the same subject. So everybody's given equal opportunity. Easy as great, as Bukola Odoe just said, that it's not just 1.7, but down the line could be 7 billion. How do you see it from your perspective?
I think, no, thank you very much, Dr. Ogunshakin. I've been reflecting on some of the issues, and I think a lot of the points raised by the panelists truly paint a picture in terms of what Africa is facing and the opportunities which are there. I actually also just want to draw attention to the fact that while sustainable construction and green construction projects are desirable, even in the very developed parts of the world, there tends to be some cost premium to it. And this cost usually could be from 1 to 25%, at least when we think about the initial cost. But I think there's a lot of scope, particularly, and I would say innovation as well. And I would say it's a bit of a multi-stakeholder approach. And the perspective I would be thinking of is there is an opportunity for us to learn also from what are the best practices from other parts of the world. Some of those best practices, particularly if we look at the building sector, just as has been mentioned, is that we're trying to think of what are the new ways in which we could generate energy. Again, Africa has the highest potential for solar energy. We're starting to see a little bit of an embrace of green hydrogen projects, but also there is still some problems, particularly with electricity generation and just having to deal with the poverty issues. And so because a lot of lack happens in that context, a lot of people tend to back out of even green construction, despite the fact that it may have a payoff environmentally on the long run. And I basically think, just like Mr. Opuiyo mentioned, that it has to be holistic in the sense that we will struggle to grow green without actually addressing some of those economic complexities that we face all across Africa. And I was just tracking some of the opportunities for green bonds, for example, across Africa. You know, it's just in the last 10 years, we are starting to see green bond become an issue. We're starting to also realize that, particularly for government, and maybe Mrs. Bukola Odoe also mentioned it, credit rating for a lot of African, I would say, institutions are not as great. And that actually means that some of the access that we could have had to finance, and particularly for green projects, may be lacking. So I believe that there are lots of issues, but one of the things I would be interested to look at is what will be the low-hanging fruit for us, particularly in Africa, such that we will be able to address this more holistically, but also we'll be able to get solutions that would pay, I would say, not just immediate dividends, but I would say sustainable and resilient dividends over a long period of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've all had individual contribution on this subject. In fact, we've combined question 1 and question 2, which is quite good, but I really want to do a little bit, in deep down. In the role of the financial institution, where I can see Opuiyo saying, yes, we're asset manager, but that we need to take all this into consideration. I hear Jenni saying, well, we look at the gender dimension. Actually, we need to think smart. And I also hear Mrs. Bukola saying to me that the opportunity is greater than we can ever envisage. Matthew, on the other hand, is saying, if I get it right, well, we're here because we see the opportunity is real. It's not a joke. It is real. So the question for us is, what is the role of the financial institution? And let me say, because Opuiyo has plenty of time to reflect, he's set the pace. So I'm going to come back to him again and say, Opuiyo, you are in the position, I wouldn't actually say you are a subsidiary of AFDB, but actually you are. But you are an asset manager because you are involved in both greenfield and secondary market. So what is the role of financial institution across in the spread of infrastructure investment in Africa? Opuiyo, do you want to give us your take on that, please?
Sure. Just to, again, put in perspective as well, especially the role of the AFDB, which plays a really, really important role as the premier DFI and multilateral on the continent of Africa. AFDB is one of Africa 50's 37 shareholders. I'd mentioned before 33 African countries besides AFDB. You have the Central Bank of Morocco. Incidentally, the government of Morocco is a shareholder. We have the Central Bank of West African States, and more recently PIC, which is the Public Investment Corporation of South Africa. They run the biggest pension fund on the continent. GPF is also a shareholder. Now, within Africa 50, there are various different vehicles. I'm directly in the IAF, which is the Acceleration Fund. It's a private equity fund with 22 investors, several of whom are African. In fact, the vast majority, 20 are African. I'll come back to that story. Now, how does all of this tie to the question you've just posed about the role of institutions on the continent. When I talked about, again, contexting what green construction was all about, I started with money. There needs to be money. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge, AFDB also estimates that when you look at between now and 2030 on an annual basis, the amount of money that Africa needs to fund infrastructure, and then if you add on the bits around adaptation and mitigation and resilience, is about $495 billion annually. I'm not saying over 10 or 5 or whatever time horizon you want to talk about in years, annually. And then when you look at the available financing, I'm using 2024 figures here, compared to that need, the gap is still about $400 billion annually and above. So having access to capital is really, really important. If I keep it simple, we can look at capital from sources out with Africa and sources within Africa. And in that context of green finance specifically, which has become now another subset of global finance, I already mentioned about 1.4 trillion available. Now, incidentally, if I take it away from whether it's green, black, or blue, or whichever kind of finance it is, and we look at the capital available on the continent, AFDB has also estimated there's something like about $2.5 trillion of assets under management by African institutions, pension funds, insurance funds, sovereign wealth funds, and several others. Some of which, if it can be channeled towards infrastructure, would be a great help. Now, that capital can play a role in various ways. At some stage, and when you look at the need for infrastructure in Africa, and again, the theme here is about green construction, the vast majority of our need is actually greenfield. It doesn't exist. In many parts of Africa, you don't have basic roads or basic power plants or basic buildings and water treatment plants, schools, call it what you like. They don't exist. And so there's a need to actually build completely fresh infrastructure from scratch. That itself requires a certain level of risk capital in terms of those who will now look at it from an early stage, look at the conceptual sides of it, take some risks to develop the project to a level where it is possible to bring in now long-term capital, typically in the form of equity debts and maybe some variants like mezzanine financing of all sorts. So that process itself has to be financed. When you get to that bankability stage, you raise that long-term capital to build, that has to get financed. And at some point, those that took that early stage risk to either develop the projects or come in at the greenfield stage will want to possibly exit, take out their capital returns, and maybe either recycle into the next generation of investments, or they might want to stay there and just get yield. So it's important that there's also a role to play in a secondary market that can help take out that early stage finance. Interesting example that's been already talked about in terms of green corporate bonds or green bonds. I will share with you that one of the projects that Africa 50 Group is, and by the way, in the last 8 or so years, we've done about 32 projects across 30 African countries, which is quite significant. So there's a lot of knowledge and experience there. One of our projects is in Benban in Egypt, where you have arguably one of the largest, not the largest, operational solar farms in the world, and certainly in Africa. And there we are generating 400 megawatts from 6 operational solar power plants. One of the ways that we refinanced that project after building it and getting it to stability, now generating yield, was to issue a corporate bond. That was in 2022, raised or refinanced $335 million. So it shows you again that the role of institutions can also be critical. I also want to give a very, very important focus again on African institutions, because one of the things that we've seen, and I'm speaking at it from, again, you and I go back a long way, Nelson, both from the global experience and the local experience. And I'm saying to you here that it's a really, really tall order sometimes to raise capital to invest on the continent. And there's a lot of constraints. Green finance these days, there are certain rules. Does it comply, for example, with the definition of what is mitigation finance or adaptation finance? Are we aligned with, the Paris Climate Agreement? And even then again, when you look at the joint methodology, et cetera, I think we'll come to that later on. You're either universally aligned or you're not, but there's also a gray area of something in between. All of these things sometimes can make it very difficult. And unfortunately for Africa, sometimes the bulk of that capital rests offshore. So what we're seeing on the continent, and more what we hear, is the more we can get African institutions themselves taking risk in our own projects, helping to de-risk that perception that you can't get things done on the continent, it's too difficult. It's one of the ways, I would say, of encouraging others to now come and join us. But Africa's urgency, and I'm going to stop shortly, especially to deal with poverty and other issues like that, is such that we can't wait, excuse me if I sound a bit controversial, for any sort of badge type of financing. We need financing, period. And if it means starting with African institutions, we need to move ahead and do that. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Opuiyo. You and I go a long way. I'm not going to go over that record. We've been in the business of building, developing, exiting, and actually doing primary one and secondary one. And what excites me about what you said, which I think was quite critical, is it seems like you're implying the African institutions need to come together and actually try and pull themselves together to address this thing. Now, within that context, one of the things that was touched on about earlier, and I think it was Jenni that talked about the regulatory environment, the planning, and all of that. Let me see if I can bring Bukola in, Odoe, because she's going through the regulatory process. Now, I know you represent a particular state government, but can you talk holistically, why not the whole of Africa, how we need to, because a lot of people talk about, there's nothing wrong about going about opportunity in Africa. The opportunity is there. Nobody's doubting it. But how do you put the seed fund into project development to make sure that project is bankable in the front end? How do we make sure the regulatory environment is ideal? And how do we make sure even the government department have the right capability to go through that process and make it attractive? So do you want to jump in there, Madam Bukola? What's your take?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ogunshakin. So just talking about the regulatory environment, let me also quickly talk about the financing aspect, because I think they're both interrelated. So I think, first of all, the banks need to also believe in the green economy space as well. What typically we've seen, even outside of the green space, with major infrastructure projects in Lagos State, is the issue around financing. And most of the time, you see the banks not wanting to fund these huge infrastructure projects only because they feel that, from the perspective of the state government also needs to put a whole lot more in, other than just bringing in the projects to the private sector. So I think for starters, the banks need to believe more in the projects, to the extent that they can provide adequate de-risking instruments that make the projects more bankable, both for private sector and for the public, who's the beneficiary of the project. Now, in terms of the regulatory framework, what Lagos State has been doing in recent years in conjunction with the federal government is the ease of doing business. We've actually had a whole institution around the ease of doing business and providing the right enabling environment for investors, both domestic and international. So what this means is there's usually a one-stop shop. For example, the Office of PPP acts as the one-stop shop for major projects. So when we get proposals for infrastructure projects, what we do is we ensure that we're able to match it with a particular ministry, department or agency, and we follow the investor, through a hand-holding process in terms of regulatory permits and approvals, and ensuring that we're able to, in addition with the owner ministry, review the project and ensure that it is both beneficial to Lagos State, which is, to the team in Lagosians, as well as ensuring that the private sector can make a decent return on investment. So in terms of regulatory approvals, we ensure that we're able to process this in a timely fashion. And also, just to use a more recent example with a huge medical project that, medical concession projects that we've only just initiated here in Lagos State. What we've been able to do, aside bringing in the land, which is our major derivative as Lagos State, we've also ensured that all the regulatory permits and fees are waived in order to ensure that the project has a sweetener for the investor as well, because we also understand that, you know, from a banking and financing perspective, it's not necessarily easy on them in terms of getting the right financing mix, both debt and equity for the project. So we've done as much as we can as Lagos State. And it's not just for that medical project alone. You know, we're rolling this out across all our major projects where we see that some of the investors are struggling with the bankability aspect of the project. So I'm not sure if that does any kind of justice to the question you've asked, Dr. Ogunshakin.
It does to some extent. It does.
More than happy to also, you know, take a, you know, deeper dive into a further dimension to the question.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I think I'd like to bring, you know, Matthew into this. Now, Matthew, you said earlier on that you want to piggyback and you want to be humble. You've done a lot of PPP projects around the world in the countries that you operate on, and listen to what Opuiyo eloquently set out to be the challenges and the opportunity, and Bukola, you know, in terms of Lagos State, you know, experience and what they are doing to de-risk and to make projects more bankable and to release the bank. How do you see, you know, your point of view as a sort of a MDB operating in Africa, in a deep sub-Saharan Africa? How do you see that coming into play now?
Yeah, I think, you know, they're excellent comments by my fellow panelists. I mean, I think, you know, what we've been successful at, and like, you know, what we'd like to, you know, roll out and you know, obviously really dig into the details of the reality of each country. But what we've been successful at is working very closely to create national facilities, national levels facilities that allow us on the PPP side to do advisory directly with the governments, with local experts to the greatest extent possible, with dedicated funds for project preparation, for PPP advisory, and a pipeline of projects that we've sort of pre-vetted with our client, which is the government client. And that model has worked in places like, you know, it's working in Uzbekistan. We've just created a new one in Egypt. We had one that's the predecessor for everything in Greece. So these national project preparation facilities is one way of doing it. And I think it's an improved model from you know, what I think typically has been done by multilateral development banks is they sort of have a very centralized approach where in the headquarters they create a small team of experts and they sort of fly in and out. I've, you know, over a few decades of work in this area, I'm convinced that working on the ground is much better. And so that's on, you know, that's one aspect, I think. The other, though, I wanted to highlight is, you know, before you can be successful, or one of the key ingredients for being successful with PPPs, is you really have to figure out and think deeply about who's going to pay for the infrastructure. I mean, you obviously can have revenues directly generated by the thing that you build, that you finance. You think of airports or ports, which helps a lot, you know, those kind of direct revenue generation. Or you have to have some sort of funding mechanism for something that's of a more general nature for socioeconomic benefits, like social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, et cetera, that are run sort of on a facilities management basis, because there isn't direct revenues for public sector projects for those types of PPPs. So you've got to think about the revenue generation, and I think that gets to the heart of what you know, I've always thought is super important, is that countries and cities, because we work a lot at the subnational level, and looking forward to engaging with Lagos State and other of the cities that are at that point with, you know, looking at direct investments. It's really helping them to build up capacity to raise revenues. So we work very deeply at, for example, with cities, with local utilities, thinking about their operational efficiency, thinking about their revenue generation, thinking about tariffs, thinking about raising quality of service in exchange for higher tariffs, done gradually over time. We've been able to do this in other countries, and it's there's no secret or different nature of Eastern European cities or Southeastern European cities versus anywhere else in the world. They simply got on with the task of creating the revenue that then is the backing for their ability to invest and pay for improved infrastructure. So I think that idea of sort of creating the credit worthiness because of increased operational efficiency, revenue generation, asset specific investments. I think that's sort of very, very key to all of this, and we look forward to trying to bring some of that experience that we've had in other places to the new countries we're going to work in. And I think it's just such a tremendous moment to be doing this. The world has a lot of chaos, and yet one of the places that has the strongest and the most need and the strongest demographics, I go back to that, is places in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're gonna just get to it and work with all of you. We want to partner with you, as I said, and I'm sure there's a ton of things we can do together. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Jenny, in your introduction, I know that you said you've just completed one particular tranche from one of your funders, and I suspect looking across your operating countries where you're looking at, you've got a lot of example. Do you have any example you want to share with us, Jenny, at all, in this area where, I think, the, institutions, finance institutions has actually come in and helped and deliver projects that, that was perhaps difficult, but become bankable. Jenny?
Yeah, no, thank you, Nelson, for that question. And that really does ring straight to my heart. I think just to add a different kind of financing vehicle that maybe hasn't been discussed is blended finance. And I think that's a really critical area. And I think there will be more blended finance type of structures coming to the market, in particular, as we see greater work around this Article 6, which is in particular on the carbon mitigation side, but it's growing all the time with basically nature solutions and in that carbon market and the green market for green financing for not only infrastructure, but really also largely for infrastructure to help with that. And so we've seen, for example, and blended finances where you're bringing in some form of concessional financing to support and to crowd in private investors and people or commercial providers of capital. And I think that's a really important aspect to the development of infrastructure and a greener and more sustainable economies on our continent. And so I think I'd love to talk about the one example in particular, but I mean, another example very quickly is Kigali's Green City pilot, which has actually been funded concessionally through KfW alongside a private property developer, which actually has helped reduce that risk of this Green City project and really provide those commercial returns for that private sector developer to come in and take that project on. And I think that's super important. Again, just to go back to the e-mobility company that we've invested in Ghana, sorry to bring that back, but again, they have qualified for the second ITMO. In fact, the first one led by a woman and a woman-founded company. And this is a really strong revenue stream over the next 5 years that helps mitigate the risk to bring in private investors such as ourselves. We actually took a convertible stance prior to them actually receiving this ITMO and getting it signed off. And we've then subsequently been able to convert that into equity. And I think this is a really important element. And this also provides that long-term funding that is required for the e-mobility industry and for construction, which are often long-term projects and have a longer duration. And so it required different types of funding. So I think that's been really critical. And I'm really excited to see that there are more and more opportunities in terms of that. I think the leaders at this time in green finance, really South Africa, I think has got something like 900 projects that have been authorized through its green financing infrastructure. But then the other sub-Saharan countries like Kenya And just in terms of their national framework, they've been really quite creative at how they're looking to ensure that there's actually equality even at the real grassroots. So they've got a mandate which has really been built into their national framework, where 40% of net earnings of community-based projects need to go back to communities, and then 25% for non-land-based projects then go back into the beneficiaries of the communities. And I think this just speaks to some really quite impactful financing that can come from these green initiatives and sustainability, and really empowerment. So for our e-mobility company, for example, they're actually incentivizing, one, the Ghanaian government gets some proceeds from these particular carbon credits, but also so do the riders. So they're incentivized to continue to ride, because at the moment they're just doing e-bikes, and that's what this project is financing. So it's really the gig economy rider. But that is also another way of incentivizing the uptake of green opportunities and climate mitigation opportunities in the continent. And obviously hugely important for health mitigation, for health improvement. And so, yeah, I think that's really just to touch on kind of another tool. And then I think another tool that we maybe didn't think about are also hybrid kind of bonds with quasi-equity type of instruments as well. And I think the African Development Bank, just to come back to Opuiyo, has been really instrumental in that as well. So I think that, you know, they're going to be increasing green finance opportunities for the continent, and we're excited to be playing a role in that.
But Jenny, you know, you touched on the, bond. I'm going to come back to that later on. But we've covered the issue about current state of the green construction and infrastructure in Africa. We talk about investment opportunities, great, and trend is there. The role of the financial institution is what we've just covered. The last item we need to cover now, which we're going to do the reverse, and this is what I want to bring Dr. Tokede into it, is really everybody talk about grain. You know, how do you measure? What is the methodology that is available in the marketplace, accredited and well-known, that you think we should be thinking about across Africa? Understanding the comment that Opuiyo raised at the beginning, that, we still have fundamental gap in building business as usual. Yes, but we also have an opportunity to build, from scratch, green investable asset, because we have the opportunity. Now, if we're going to do that, measurement is critical. So what's your take on how best we can actually inject proper methodology of measuring all the sustainability elements? This is your floor.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Nelson Ogunshakin. I think this is a very important issue, particularly when we talk about green construction. There are some school of thought that we argue that that there's no globally acclaimed definition for what green is in particular, and that has been a recurrent issue, not just within the developing country, but obviously, I guess we could almost, for the purposes of this discussion, come to talk about responsible, I would say, environmental conscious practices that can allow us to at least mitigate, if not improve, our environmental performance in the future. Now, I might be a little bit biased, but I would sort of give a little bit of options, but I don't think they're going to be conflicting. So while I introduce myself, I mentioned that I am a life cycle assessment certified practitioner. And if we think about the situation, particularly in Europe, in the US, we're starting to see increasing embrace of life cycle assessment. In Australia, the National Construction Code already is incorporating some of these practices as well, making sure that, when we think about supply chains of industries and companies, that once there's a bit of a particular dollar amount, or what I'll call monetary figure, then you are compelled to actually have your environmental product declarations clearly did. And life cycle assessment is quite a very big one. But I would also mention that for countries that are struggling particularly with having such a holistic perspective, embodied carbon is starting to be what I would say low-hanging fruits. And in such instances, this is where we start to look at what are the sort of materials, how are we extracting our materials, what exactly is the global warming potential. Now, there are lots of things we think about, particularly in that upfront stage. And of course, infrastructures, just as been mentioned, they tend to have very long lifespan. So that actually means that it's not just what happens just in the front end of extracting materials, putting them together, transporting them, and obviously trying to install them to make up exciting infrastructures in the future. But we also need to think about the energies we're going to be using to run them. I mean, if we think about places like Indonesia, obviously in China, we're starting to see a lot of what we call high-speed, rail projects. And although these things are very expensive, but just as you mentioned, because the demographics of Africa is quite huge, these are sort of very timely investments that we should be thinking about. So I would argue that the methodology I would advocate for, and particularly that should be embraced by policymakers, should be looking at how we can start to look at life cycle assessment, but also starting to look at carbon accounting and embodied carbon calculations. And I think that itself is going to be a step forward for us. And it doesn't have to be one of the other, but we could try as much as possible to start to look at it in that context. And I would also mention that these are not just technical methodologies, but we could also impute them into a lot of financial instruments. We can start to use them to benchmark, who are those that we're going to be working with, and financial institutions. I would say this is where the African Development Bank may want to take a cue from what we have with the European Central Bank, making sure that we're more active in policy and ensuring that policy actually guides the development and implementation of green construction projects in Africa. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Shegun, I'm just giving you a cue that in about 5 minutes, we're going to be ready to look at Q&A from the floor. A lot is being said. I just want to bring all this four together in the next 5 minutes before we open the question to the floor. Dr. Tokede, you talked about carbon accounting, and you talk about embedded, carbon, and you challenge that we need to look at a holistic life cycle. I take a holistic approach. My approach has always been a case that over my 45 years of being a player in the construction and infrastructure industry, I think that's long enough, 45 years of working all over the world. There's the principle of a whole life cost. Depending on who you are at the front end of the project, you want to go for a quick wheel and you come out, and you hold it onto the asset all the way through. That would determine how much money you put in your front end. In your front end comes into your development cost, as Opuiyo eloquently talked about it. That is the construction cost of the asset, and there's the operation and maintenance of that asset. It's come in three components: the development, the construction, and the asset management. In most cases, people who are in for a quick win, they want to minimize the development cost to the minimum. They want to minimize the construction cost for the end balloon on the cost of the operation of the asset. And what you're advocating is that we've got to be able to track the measurement in terms of carbon, throughout the whole process. Is that a concept that you think we can actually put across to investors? And if it's investor, what type of investor are likely to look at that whole life cost? Because I have a concept that if you take a ratio of 150 and 200, 1 is the development cost, 50 the construction cost, and 200 is the whole life cost. Sometimes the developer want to squeeze the 1 to 0.75 and compromise on the engineering and building that in. And they want to squeeze the construction to the bare minimum to the extent that your whole life costs become 300 and 400. The real challenge, whether it's for the multilateral development bank, the asset management, the project owner, how do we convince them that it's worthy of investing up in the front end to make sure the issue that we have to address, like we use the proper material, we take a look for life cycle, we use the material, and we track the carbon emission from the whole process. How do we convince the investor to take that holistic view from your point of view?
No, thanks again. That's a really good question. And I think the complexity is particularly with trying to deal with investors. If you don't mind me saying, I think just looking at practices across the world that have been able to achieve green construction infrastructure and practices, it's a little bit difficult to particularly go through developers and investors, particularly because their motive is particularly short-lived, and that is very well understood, and the reason and rationale for it is well known. And that is why a lot of times we try as much as possible to look at an unbiased empire that particularly would be around for a much longer time. And this is why policies tends to be a bit of a starting point, that if we can actually lobby policy and get policymakers to be on our side, then we can then start to deal with investors, particularly in looking at how they might not necessarily get the sort of returns that they want, but then we can start to look at how, for example, investing in sustainable practices can start to give them a competitive edge over some of their rivals. And that is where, again, this sort of environmental profiling, transparent working together. I mean, for example, we look at people like Dangote, who's the richest man in Africa now, who's got his hands in many areas. We need such big players, for example, to actually start to come clean to us in terms of what are their own environmental performance, how are they particularly investing in it. And so we're not trying to put such people on the spotlight now, but we're just trying to say that if we start with policy, then we have a better chance to look at some of the biggest players. And I guess this is going to cascade down to some of the mid and low, but it's just going to be pretty hard for us to be looking at some of the small and medium scale enterprises and investors and developers, because the practices across the world tells us that it is extremely difficult to work with such group of people to convince them, even though they do have a lot of opportunity to be able to make change at that level.
Okay, thank you very much. At this point, I can see a lot of questions. I'm sure Segun is going through them, systematically try and pick up. I see a question from Malani from South Africa, and which is quite an interesting one, and directly to Opuiyo. I'm not sure whether Opuiyo has picked it up, but I suspect if you read it through, it's a Mr. Oforiokuma, the challenge of being able to raise the risk finance you alluded to is what is the challenge. As a professional engineer, we're able to even categorize projects in terms of bankability upfront is very accurate. However, finding the risk finance to the risk engagement is the challenge. How can the continent and the professional on the continent raise such capital? Opuiyo, this is direct one to you. What's your take?
Yeah, it's an absolutely fundamentally important question that has been raised by engineer Malani. Because if you look at the life cycle, and I'm focusing here on the infrastructure of an infra project, and remember I placed emphasis on the bulk of the need at the moment on the continent being greenfield. That therefore says somebody is doing a lot of work in terms of developing from early stage to get them to bankability, at which point the longer term capital can come in. Now, just to go back to some data and statistics, a study by McKinsey, and I think I've also heard similar results from UNDP, indicates that 90% of the projects that start at the early development stage never get to bankability. Only 10% does. As a consequence, at the very, very early stage of the overall life cycle, the risks are highest because you can put in money, and that is both cash as well as human resources. Like I've said before, time is money, to try and get a project to bankability stage. And then you find that you don't raise the capital. And frankly speaking, your development cost is a wipeout. So I fully understand the challenge that Engineer Malani is worried about. But I have to also say to you, this is why, there are various institutions out there. For example, Africa 50, we were set up as part of this journey to develop a pipeline starting with early stage projects. I heard Matthew talk about the pipeline earlier on. And so one of the various vehicles within our overall asset management structure is one called Africa 50 Project Development. Now, in context of green infrastructure, just again to say that there genuinely is hope. There's a vehicle that we achieved first close of and announced this in August of this year, called the African Green the African Green Infrastructure Alliance, AGIA. This is an initiative of Africa Development Bank. And within that overall umbrella of the AGIA vehicle, the bit that has to do with project development, AGIA PD, is being managed by Africa 50. And there we did the first close of about $118 million. Hopefully we'll raise about $400 million just dedicated to developing greenfield infrastructure on the continent of Africa. And you have, besides, AFDB, the Bank of West African States. You have others like, for example, KfW, which is the German Development Bank. You have UK FCDO, which is the one that oversees BII. I'm sure you've heard all about BII. You have the likes of Soros Foundation. You have the African Climate Foundation as well. So different players coming together pretty much in the sort of blended finance concept that we heard Jenni talk about. And if you look at the multiplier effect, typically with development capital to what can eventually come out as, fully fledged projects, it can be up to 10 times of the development capital you put in there. So the point I'm trying to say, Dr. Maloney, I do recognize that it's not easy to get that capital, but there are institutions that already are doing this. And the key thing is for developers like yourselves, if you're one of those, you must also remember that in partnering with others, sometimes, I've seen so many of these opportunities come, somebody with a great idea, and they say, look, I want you to finance 100% of this. Usually there's one concept for us as financiers, whether you're looking at it at early stage or mid stage or late stage, which is what is your skin in the game? And actually, I want to quickly pivot into another question I know that exists there. I wasn't saying, ladies and gentlemen, that only African institutions should finance African projects. Frankly speaking, we don't have enough capital on the continent to meet all of our needs, but rather what we're saying is African institutions should be ready to put the best foot forward, take a lead, and in taking skin in the game in our own backyard, that encourages others to come, whether it be others on the continent or out with the continent. Another thing to think about as well is there are credit mitigation and risk mitigation instruments that can also be used in structuring. And the DFIs, the multilaterals, are very important in this. AFDB already plays a role. Great to hear from Matthew what EBRD is doing. And there are many other players. And we believe that they have a key role to play in this space, in providing capital that can help to start these projects off. You have USTDA, for example, offering grants to help people develop projects and paying for those costs. But at the same time, there's got to be other innovative ways. Maybe in some cases, they will talk about refundable grants. So you get a grant to start the deal, but if you get to bankability, then that money gets returned so that the grant provider can now put that into something else. Look, there are different formulae out there of what can happen. So it's not an easy thing to do. It requires perseverance. Maybe one final thing I would say is that if we can be dedicated to seeing success of projects we develop on the continents, you actually, over the long term, deliver the results that they should, the risk perception of Africa will diminish. This is part of the challenge, that Africa is often seen as a high risk. And I would put it to you that, frankly speaking, the perception is not always reality, even though perception often is considered as truth. If you look at studies by Moody's, that default rates on African infrastructure and infrastructure across the world, I believe that in the latest study today, Africa has the lowest default rate, something like about, I think, 1 to 1.5 or 2%, compared to much higher at the rate of 7 to maybe 10% in more developed parts of the world. So Africa isn't that risky. You can get things done, but again, it behoves us to do more and have success, and that will attract capital through diminishing the risk perception. You can wrap, some projects. There's one I can think about we did back in Nigeria years ago. I happen to be one of the co-developers of that. It's called the Azure EDOP IPP. This raised almost $900 million to build a 460 plus megawatt power plant. And that was wrapped with, partial risk guarantee from the World Bank.
And
you had the PRI and so on and so forth. So there are different formulae that can actually be applied to make these things work. But it does need time. It does need patience. It does need perseverance. And for those of us taking the risk, we must be also willing to have some skin in the game and not just look to other people to always bank them for us.
The case you mentioned is something that I had to live with as the chair of the investment committee. I had to go through that with you, so I know exactly the chapter and verses on that, and I know the history on that. There's a lot of questions coming through here. I just want to make sure we get equal right to everybody. There's a particular question here, which is specifically of Bukola Odoe. I think he's from Professor Kati from Malawi. It said, thanks for the case study for Lagos State. I like the idea to strictly come up with regulations and follow them up regularly. My concern in Africa is the lack of enforcement of this instrument. So how do you enforce them in Lagos or Nigeria or as a whole across Africa? So Bukola, there is a specific punchy question for you. It's nice to have them, but applying them is always the issue. I mean, Opuiyo talked about Zero Project was a challenge one at the beginning. The process was there, but the application of it was difficult. So the one you articulate for Lagos sounds great, but actually, how do you enforce it? And what happens when there's a change of government and you go from one party to the other party? What is the practicality? How do you make sure that you have continuity? Because these projects are not for 3 years or 5 years. They are a longer period, and you have to take that into dimension when you're applying this process. So your floor, please.
Thank you, Ogunshakin. So thank you, Professor Effie, for that very thoughtful question. You are absolutely right, because across Africa, I don't think that we suffer from a lack of policies, but rather it's more of weak enforcement of the instruments that we already have. And Lagos State has been very deliberate about this in a way, and what we do is we structure our PPPs in a way that builds compliance into the system itself, rather than treating it as an afterthought. So using the Clean Lagos Energy Market, which is one of our benchmark energy projects here in Lagos State, we've created a climate action plan which has clear measurable targets that the state government is legally committed to. And what this does is it creates accountability at the highest levels. Secondly, in terms of using the Office of Public-Private Partnerships as the enforcement mechanism, what we do is rather than chasing after compliance, we ensure that the concession agreements themselves, the licensing frameworks, already have embedded regulatory obligations. So for example, if a particular concessionaire does not meet the standards, it affects their ability to continue to operate or access financing in of itself. So what we do is to ensure that enforcement is not commercialized rather than just being administrative in nature. And then thirdly, we have a process of building transparency and monitoring into the system. So we have periodic reporting, as well as ensuring that the reports are being made public. For example, in Office of PPP, we have, it's just skipped my mind now, an implementation and monitoring committee. And what they do is to ensure that in addition to the owner ministry or department or agency that owns the project, we're doing quarterly, sometimes monthly inspections to ensure that the projects are coming up in a way that, that has been captured in the concession agreement. And finally, what we've seen in Lagos State, and this is the Lagos lesson, is that enforcement works best when it is tied to incentives and bankability. So developers and investors know that compliance with green regulations, for instance, is not just a box-ticking exercise. It is essentially what unlocks their access to finance, concessional support, and a credible place in Lagos State's long-term infrastructure market. So to also come back to Dr. Ogunshakin's last question, which is how do you ensure continuity with projects when there's a change in government? That is always a risk that concessionaires have to tackle with, because obviously we know that our democracy is quite young. But what I can definitely tell you is that none of the concessions that Lagos State has entered into in the last 20 years have been tampered with. In all that we have done, we've ensured that there's continuity in terms of the contractual provisions that we have. And most of the time, when you look at the choice of law and choice of forum clauses in the contracts, we ensure that they're in settled jurisdictions where the law is very clear and settled, because that also gives investor confidence that in the event that the contract doesn't go the way that they envisioned, that there's actually, a very neutral arbiter of justice that can actually weigh in and ensure that the contractual provisions are enforced, and where they're not enforced, they're properly compensated for the loss of return on investment. So that is always going to be a challenge, Dr. Ogunshakin, in terms of change in government. I don't think there's any way to completely hedge away that risk. However, from a Lagos perspective, I'm talking about the Lagos lessons, we are yet to see any concession agreement that has been cancelled. And this is also because we've had stability in government since 1999 here in Lagos State. So it's not anything that any concessionaire has to worry about. I make bold to say that this is one of the strongest subnationals that you would have in Nigeria. That you have.
You are absolutely right. I know the track record of Lagos State government. But I think the question is more wider than Lagos State government, and it's always good to use Lagos State as an exemplar of good practices. I understand we have 10 minutes before we wrap up, because this conversation can go on for a long time. There's a killer question that it comes in multiple of 5 questions, and Segun has been kind to point it to me. So I'm not going to be selfish by asking one person to answer the question. I'm going to read all the questions, and I'm sure you can see, and I'm going to ask individual 5 to pick it up as we go through. The question is a general question for Alamu Getu from Alamu in Ethiopia, and perhaps this should go across. I'm sure you've read it. So construction is not just a sector. It is the scaffolding of Africa's future. Well, if you're not a contractor, you don't know what you mean by scaffolding. Scaffolding is what really, really bring everything together for those who are engineers, is what hold it together. And the question that goes to say, yet today, only 2 out of 54 nations host Lean Construction Initiative. Just for 5 have adopted Green Building Code. 1 more is on the way. This is not innovation, it is stagnation. So the question, which are very simple, when will lean construction and green building become mandatory in every national construction policy? One big question. Second, what concrete step are you taking to embed sustainable construction skill in university and vocational matter? This is going to education. Maybe Dr. Tokede can come into that. And third one, it goes on, if 2 countries can launch lean and 5 can adopt green code, what is the step, what's stopping the other 50 countries to actually go through this? And the list goes on. And finally, it said, can government and development banks support lean construction training and standard? So it's all about, yes, we are talking about it. Yes, this is real. Yes, it's happening. But actually, how can we put our hands around together, whether you are government, financial institution, or construction supply chain? Because I sense the opening comment that Opuiyo said earlier on. Let's understand the baseline. Let's understand what's this whole concept. And he also said earlier on that, look, there's so much green to be built from scratch. How can we look at an institutional, a continental approach to solve this? This is what I believe this question is at. So if we only got 2 countries out of the whole of 50 something, what can we do? This is the word of advice. I want to start by putting the question. I don't want it to be a long answer, a short bullet point coming from each and every one of you. Matthew has been the quiet one so far, and I know that because he keeps telling me he's the new kid on the block and he wants to ride on the back of the other. If there's going to be any message coming through from this question, this is about growing. If we're going to embrace it holistically, I'm going to put the question to you one by one, or 2 sentences to address that together. So can I put Matthew on the queue, please? Matthew.
Yeah. Sure. Actually, this is really timely. We just approved our new infrastructure strategy, and with respect to buildings, I mean, it's very clear. We will finance buildings. So if you think of schools, hospitals, housing, etc., that meet high international green building standards. Period. I mean, that we've made a commitment to that. The only way those projects go through is when they meet those really high standards. And there are a couple of big ones around the world, but the point is that we've set a very high bar for this. We believe this is the way to go, whether it's local materials, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's the full life cycle cost. It's got to be efficient, and it has to meet those high standards. And if we think this is the way to go, and we think it's doable, and we think it's affordable as well over a whole life cycle. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I bring Jenni into it? Jenni, the same, please. The same question to you, Jenni.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think that we are seeing an increase in green building councils and certification across the continent. South Africa certainly, I think Kenya, through the Kenya Green Building Society, has driven the adoption of the IFC Edge certification. I think that's really important. Ghana, Nigeria, Rwanda, I think are all building councils under the World Green Building Council. So I think that we're seeing a bigger drive globally to ensure that there are national climate and energy policies, and I think this is really important. Morocco, again, has got some really strong national climate initiatives that it's building. Rwanda has adopted the Green Building Minimum Compliance Standard. South Africa, again, the energy efficient building regulations. Nigeria, I think the National Building Code, I think probably Bukola can probably touch on that better than I can. But I do think there is a big initiative to support this, just like EBRD is supporting the green finance, green initiatives for green buildings and green construction. And I think going forward, this is going to be an increasing theme. If you want to raise the financing for a project, it needs to meet these green standards. And so I like to believe that this will be much more inclusive going forward as more and more nations. And I believe the African Development Bank is actually also working on harmonizing green and sustainable construction for the continent in conjunction with the African Union. So I think there's obviously a lot more work to do, as Opuiyo stated at the very beginning. It is nascent, but I think there is a collective initiative across the continent. And I think generally there is recognition that green construction isn't just an environmental imperative. It can lead to energy savings, improved health, resilience, and obviously huge economic benefits through the life cycle that I think Dr. Tokede also talked about. And so I think that the potential requires addressing deep-rooted structural, financial, and systemic barriers, but I think there's a lot to do. I think that I liked what Bukola also touched on for Lagos, and with kind of milestone-based incentives to achieve that. So I think there's a huge opportunity. I think there's a lot still to be done, but I think we're moving in that direction, and that's really positive.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jenny. Can I bring Dr. Tokede back in very quickly, one sentence to try and wrap up? I'm conscious of the time.
Yeah, so I particularly just want to address the part of green building where we think about when it's going to become mandatory. I really just want to say that although policy, the government has a very strong role to play, but I also want to say a lot of lobby group, particularly some of the ones mentioned, the Kenyan Building Society, the Nigerian Green Building Council. We have a lot to do, particularly in measuring our emissions, and particularly putting the case, a briefing document, a policy document, a green paper. All of those things are going to be very helpful in order to move us closer. And in terms of the concrete steps to sort of look at how we can embed sustainable skills, I think there's a lot of initiatives that are going on, but it's also very important that we realize that we need to start to create a product that obviously is being used. At the African Life Cycle Initiative, we realize that there's a lot of appetite for us to be able to train people, but one of the things that is holding it back is looking at how well are some of those skills still sort of attractive within that environment. So I would also say again that this is where we have to look at a lot of things, particularly from the National Universities Commission, but also we have to go from the bottom up to ensure that, people who eventually have sustainable skills, they have this capacity, they do have a very important role to play, particularly in our building and our construction sector. So thank you, Dr. Ogunshakin.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Bukola to come in, and then I'll finish up with Opuiyo before we wrap up. Bukola, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ogunshakin. So I'll talk about the bankability of green construction projects. And for me, this is where PPPs come in, because honestly, bankability is all about de-risking. And what we've done in Lagos State is to ensure that we're able to de-risk in a way and manner that also complies with the law. For instance, under the PPP law, we're not able to give guarantees. But in recent years, we've become more innovative with the way we've typically structured what looks like a guarantee and operates like a guarantee, but it's not a guarantee. So for example, in some of our mobility concessioning projects, what we've done is to give minimum ridership incentive to the concessionaires just to be able to ensure that the project becomes bankable. So what I see about, ensuring a long-term bankability of green construction projects in Africa and more Nigeria specifically, I think government must guarantee. So from a regulatory perspective, we need to go back to change the law to be able to provide guarantees. We must also be able to provide a stable regulatory environment, which is what we have been doing. DFIs can also come in to provide blended finance and also help to lower the cost of capital. And also project developers must show life cycle savings so that lenders can predict, the cash flows. For us, I talked about our green bond issuance earlier, and I believe that this for us helps us to tie investor appetite directly to green outcomes, because we've already had an oversubscription of the green bond issuance, and eventually for me, when the frameworks are credible, capital definitely follows.
Okay, thanks very much, Bukola. Can I bring Opuiyo? You started the conversation. I want you to finish with a very good punchy line to set off us, and I'll wrap up. Opuiyo, back to you. 1 minute.
No, thanks a lot. First of all, let me say that I agree with everything I've heard from all my other colleagues on the panel. So I'm not going to approach this from that angle. Where I'd like to look at this from is probably from the softer side. Why do I emphasize softer side? Like I said, today, green construction, setting up green construction institutes is not yet truly a thing on the continent. Yet still, we know from data, and we talked about this much earlier on, that Africa is the one that is most adversely impacted by the ravages of climate change. So I see three important things. Education, which is both establishing lean construction and other types of institutes so people can understand the philosophy, technologies, methodologies, etc., to tackle this. But also, I talk about a culturalization, which is even softer. Getting people, not only the people with the doctor titles or the master titles or whatever degree titles that we all hold, but people right to the very ground level, demographically, those in the rural areas on the farms, understanding that this thing called climate change is real. For example, when the sort of heavy flooding comes or the droughts, that affects the farmer on the ground. They are capable of understanding this. Everybody is. So if we can take it to that level, it then becomes a burning platform and an imperative for all of us as Africa to work together to seek this change. So that's the education bit. The second thing is getting, or the second and third things are getting on and doing it. But in doing it, it's really important that we focus on doing things in a way that are relevant. Like I've already said, Africa has many challenges, including solving poverty problems and so on and so forth, that need money, that need expertise, and so on and so forth. If we just move entirely and just say nothing else matters but green construction, I'm not answering the question, but I'm posing the question. What does that mean for the rest of the other initiatives? And we must be careful in how we do this to ensure that we don't, how will I say, encourage bad practices. You've probably all heard about greenwashing, where everybody starts saying, oh, I'm green, but they're not really green because all they're doing is chasing a pot of money to sort of pursue their own interests. And this goes back to the point of not only, education in sort of traditional sense, but also the acculturization in our hearts and our minds. Finally, time heals everything. And we've got to think about how do we balance Africa's needs while seeking to solve this problem or the various problems, including poverty, etc., with the time available. And we must be realistic in how we do that so that we don't, again, create the bad practices and you end up taking on too much too soon. And in the end, you get frustrated in actually achieving the objectives. So I'll end on the soft side there, and I'll thank you very much for the opportunity to
very much.
have shared
Well, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
It's been a delight to host this particular one. I know Shegun is waiting patiently there. There's just a few things I need to close out with. First of all, I would like to thank all the panelists, for your fantastic contribution to this particular, deliberation. You've all brought different angles into this conversation, and jointly you've tackled it. We cover the 4 topics which we started up with, and you cover them very well. So thank you very much to Bukola, Odoe, to Matthew, Jordan, to Jenni, and Dr. Tokede, and also Opuiyo. We really extend our sincere appreciation to you, today's speakers, for your contribution to this particular meeting. It's been absolutely fantastic to have your input. I will also say to you that going forward into the next slide, you start to think about, what Construct Africa have in pipeline. We have the next topic, which is about, really leveraging technology to overcome challenges in the African construction industry. That's going to be on the 13th of November. Please register to be involved with it, so please don't miss that. We want to try and encourage as many as possible people to come on to that. And from my point of view, just before we come on to the next slide, please, it's really about bringing the overall figure of what is coming through it before. Before I wrap up, I know that as we come to the end of the conversation, I want to sincerely thank all the speakers and panelists for sharing their expertise and all you have advised us to do to participate. We have heard today a clear, green construction in Africa is not a distant aspiration. It is, present day necessity and a powerful economic opportunity. We have discussed how innovation and financing model, clearly regulation framework, and collaborative partnership can turn things together. It's important that we don't actually work in isolation. I heard the message that, it's simple, it is big, but the opportunity is there. If Matthew Jordan Tank and his team can actually go to 4 or 6 sub-Saharan African countries, means there's opportunities there. If we can hear from African 50 in terms of what they are doing and the size of the portfolio, that's exciting. And to hear what Dr. Tokede said about measurement is brilliant. To also look at what is happening in Lagos is encouraging. And the issue about looking at gender's flair and what is happening in infrastructure is also encouraging. So without further ado, I don't want to go into the African style. We started 5 minutes late. I want to finish 5 minutes late. And with that in mind, I just want to say thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you to Shegun behind the scene and all the team for putting this together. Together, you've done wonderfully well. And I just want to close on that on time within 5 minutes. So wherever you are, stay safe and take care. God bless you all. Bye.
God bless you. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.